So let's look at now how Darwin actually came up with this idea of descent with modification. Darwin wanted to be a naturalist, but his father didn't think that was a great idea. So he actually sent him to go learn to be a physician. But if you think, this was before we had anesthesia, and Darwin thought that was awful. So he actually went to Cambridge to become a clergyman, where he found an interest in botany. So after he graduated from Cambridge, he met with Robert FitzRoy, who was captain of the Beagle, and he agreed to let Darwin come with him as the ship's naturalist, but also more of kind of like a friend. So Darwin and the captain were at the same age, same social class, and they ended up just being more of like conversation partners. So you can see the trip that Darwin took on the Beagle down here. They would have left from here, right, all the way down. They basically went all the way down around South America, Australia, south of Africa, back to South America, and then back up to Europe. And so throughout this path, he made so many observations of plants and animals. He found fossils. He found fossils that resembled living species, and then living species that resembled other species from nearby regions. He observed an earthquake in Chile, so now he's getting to see some of those geological events that can change the earth. And he hypothesized that the Galapagos Islands outside of South America had actually been colonized by species from the mainland, because they looked similar, but they were slightly different. So when he made these observations, he was trying to perceive something called an adaptation. An adaptation is a new or a different characteristic, and it's closely related to this process of natural selection, in that the adaptation is going to be beneficial for that specific individual in their specific environment. So here are some of Darwin's Galapagos finches. And if you'll notice, the beaks are slightly different. So this one's average length, average width. This one's kind of long and skinny. And then this one is really fat and kind of strong. And what he noticed was that these different beaks, right, these different adaptations, tended to fit with their different environments. He saw these moderate beaks eating kind of cactuses, so little tough fleshy plants. These skinny beaks on birds that were mainly eating insects. And then these really strong, thick beaks on the birds that were eating kind of tougher seeds that had to be cracked open. So he wrote up an essay called, based on the theory of natural selection, after his trip, and it presented natural selection as the mechanism, right? So what we have is natural selection causes evolution, right? This is basically what he was saying in On the Origin of Species. And this natural selection is this process where individuals who have favorable adaptations, these traits, are more likely to survive in an environment, right? Like if you have a thicker beak, you're more likely to be able to eat and survive in an environment with maybe not many insects, but lots of nuts. And because you're able to eat more, you're able to reproduce more. And so you're going to pass that trait on to your next generation, to your offspring, who are then going to have thicker beaks than the previous generation. But he sat on this. Notice there's a big time gap here. He wrote it in 1844 and didn't publish it until 1858. And the only reason he did publish it then is because he actually got a letter, not an email, a letter from Sir Alfred Wallace Russel. So here's another name that you should be aware of. And Sir Alfred Wallace Russel had come up with the same idea as Darwin. and was sending it to Darwin to have him look at it to see if they were if he was on this right track. And so Darwin was not about to be scooped by Wallace, and so he quickly finished his draft and published it so that he could be the one to get all of the credit. But Alfred Russel Wallace came up with the same idea. And in this On the Origin of Species, Darwin explained kind of three broad observations, three big ideas. That life was essentially similar, right? He was seeing individuals in similar environments showing similar traits, that there was a unity to all of life. And contrastingly, he also described how there was a diversity to life, right? He could see a similar organism from the mainland to an island living in almost the same environments or slightly different environments and showing slightly different characteristics, like those beaks on the finches. So he tried to explain this contrast between how everything looked similar, yet everything showed differences. And he also used this paradigm to show this, that the organisms were suited to their environments, and that it was the environment that determined if an organism was successful or not, right? If you came to an environment and you had the correct traits, then you were suited to it, you did well, you reproduced, you sent your offspring to the next generation, and then organisms that did well there would tend to live there. If you lived in an environment you weren't suited to, you didn't do well, you didn't reproduce well, you didn't produce much genetics for the next generation. And so he didn't really use the term evolution. Modern day evolution is kind of a hot button ticket. But the word evolution literally just means change. It doesn't actually mean anything else. It just means that over time, species changed. And we know that Darwin wasn't the first one to come up with the idea of change. What was new, instead of evolution, he called it descent with modification. But what was new was this idea of natural selection. And descent with modification kind of worked in this branching theory, right? So we had some ancestral plant here, and some individuals branched off to be able to form flowers, to make angiosperms. Some other individuals developed in maybe different environments to create pine cones, to make gymnosperms. It's not saying that angiosperms came from gymnosperms or vice versa, right? That's not what this means. It means that there was some ancestor that they had in common, and they went through different routes to get to where they are today. And this branching pattern kind of worked really well with Linnaeus, his nesting classification, the binomial nomenclature. And then one other thing that Darwin noticed was that we had been causing change in plants through farming, through agriculture, not just plants and animals as well. And we call this artificial selection just because humans were involved, right? Anything that humans do is artificial. So if you go to the grocery store, which you probably shouldn't do right now, you should Instacart it. But you can find all of these things, right? These different vegetables. And they're all derivatives from the wild mustard plant. So kale was artificially selected for mustard leaves. Brussels sprouts was when we artificially selected for buds on the side. Cabbage is when we artificially selected for the buds at the top. Broccoli is artificial selection for the flowers. And then kohlrabi is artificial selection for the stems, right? So these are all different vegetables, but they all share this common ancestor. It doesn't mean that cabbage replaced wild mustard. It means that we took some wild mustard, we went and grew it in an environment where it was going to do well if we had good, big, large apical tip buds. And by do well, we mean humans literally used those plants to create the next generation of plants. And then over time, you would get larger and larger and larger and larger tip buds, and eventually have this giant head of cabbage that you could sell in omashu.